My ex called me fat, she whispered to the Mafia Boss, not knowing he'd burn the world for her. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's go back to our main character. He thought the hardest part of his day would be negotiating with ruthless rivals, but fate had prepared something far more dangerous for him. A girl who had spent years believing she was too much to be loved. Emily Parker balanced 3 oversized strawberry milkshakes on a black serving tray, her lips moving silently as she counted each careful step across the polished floor of Sweet Haven Diner in downtown Manhattan. Don't fall. Don't fall. Please don't fall, she whispered to herself with the same hopeful determination she used every morning when she looked into the mirror and promised she would stop apologizing for taking up space. At 27, Emily had become an expert at smiling before other people could pity her. She laughed at her own clumsiness before anyone else could. She joked about ordering the biggest dessert before strangers could joke about it first. It hurt less that way. At least that was the story she kept telling herself. The lunchtime crowd filled every booth, mixing the smell of grilled burgers, fresh coffee, and warm cinnamon rolls into the comforting chaos she usually loved. She greeted every customer with genuine kindness, even when her feet ached after 7 straight hours on the job. Most people remembered Emily because she was impossible to ignore. Her soft cheeks, bright blue eyes, curly blonde hair tied into a messy ponytail, and full figure made her stand out everywhere she went. Children adored her because she always made funny faces while refilling their chocolate milk. Elderly couples requested her section because she remembered birthdays without writing them down. But there were always people like Tyler. Tyler Benson walked through the front door wearing confidence that no longer belonged to him. Expensive sneakers, designer sunglasses resting on top of perfectly styled hair. The kind of smile that looked practiced rather than genuine. Emily recognized him before she wanted to. Her heart stumbled long before her feet ever could. 6 months had passed since he ended their relationship with words she still heard on lonely nights. Maybe if you loved yourself enough to lose some weight, someone else could too. She had cried quietly afterward, then blamed herself for crying. Tyler wasn't alone today. 2 friends followed behind him, laughing loudly enough to make sure everyone noticed they had arrived. Emily considered disappearing into the kitchen, but her manager had already pointed toward table 12. Your section, he mouthed with an encouraging smile, completely unaware that fate had just assigned her greatest fear to her station. Emily inhaled slowly, lifted the tray a little higher, and reminded herself that she was a professional. She had survived worse days. She could survive one lunch. She approached the table wearing the same cheerful expression she offered every guest. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Sweet Haven. Can I start you off with? Tyler looked up, froze for half a second, then laughed. Not loudly at first, just enough for his friends to notice. His eyes traveled from her face to the tray she carried and back again. Wow, he said, leaning comfortably against the booth. You're still collecting calories instead of memories. His friends chuckled automatically. Emily felt the familiar heat rush into her face. She opened her mouth to answer professionally, but no words came. Tyler wasn't finished. Honestly, amnesia. I thought heartbreak might at least shrink you a little. Several nearby conversations grew quieter. People weren't staring openly yet, but she could feel attention drifting toward their table the way it always did when embarrassment entered a room. Emily tightened her grip on the tray and forced a tiny smile that didn't reach her eyes. Would you like extra whipped cream with those milkshakes? She asked softly, pretending his words hadn't landed exactly where old wounds never truly healed. Tyler smirked. Looks like somebody already sampled enough whipped cream for both of us. A burst of laughter escaped one of his friends. Emily looked down for only a second. That single second was enough. The rubber sole of her shoe caught the edge of a loose floor mat she had reminded herself to fix earlier that morning. Time seemed to hesitate. The tray tilted. 3 towering milkshakes leaned together like dominoes, surrendering to gravity. Emily's eyes widened with innocent horror. Oh no! The glasses slipped free, spinning through the air in slow motion toward the sharply dressed man who had just stepped through the diner's front entrance. A man so calm, so impossibly composed, that even the room itself seemed to pause around him without realizing why. The frozen silence lasted barely a heartbeat before gravity finished what embarrassment had begun. Thick strawberry milkshake cascaded over the stranger's charcoal overcoat, splashed across polished leather shoes, and dripped steadily onto the spotless marble floor. One glass rolled in a slow circle before settling against his foot with a delicate clink that somehow echoed through the entire diner. Every conversation stopped. Forks hovered in midair. Even the espresso machine seemed quieter. Emily's face drained of color. Her hands flew to her mouth as if she could somehow pull the accident back into the glasses. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, already grabbing a stack of napkins from the nearest counter. "I was not looking where I was going. Please let me clean that. I promise I will pay for the dry cleaning. It might take me a while, but I will. I work double shifts, and I can." Her words tangled together faster than she could organize them. She hurried toward him with trembling hands, carefully dabbing at the front of his jacket without even asking permission, completely unaware that 4 men standing several feet behind him had instinctively taken one synchronized step forward. They wore tailored suits, expressionless faces, and unmistakable posture of people who existed only to protect someone important. One reached subtly toward the inside of his jacket before stopping at the slightest movement from the man in front of him. The stranger never flinched. He simply looked down at Emily with unreadable gray eyes while she continued apologizing to the expensive fabric instead of looking at his face. "This is definitely worse than last Tuesday," she muttered nervously. "That was only tomato soup. Strawberry leaf stains. I read that online." She suddenly stopped, frowned at the pink streak spreading across his sleeve, and sighed with genuine disappointment. "Actually, I think the internet lied." A few customers exchanged confused glances. Tyler watched from his booth with folded arms, clearly enjoying every second. "Classic Emily," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "She cannot walk across a room without causing a disaster." His friends laughed again, expecting everyone else to join them. Nobody did. The stranger slowly removed one glove and accepted the napkins from Emily's shaking hands. Instead of anger, his expression carried something far more unfamiliar. Curiosity. He glanced briefly at the enormous pink stain, then back at the woman who looked seconds away from crying simply because someone else's jacket had become dirty. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Emily blinked several times, convinced she had misheard him. "What? You almost fell," he repeated with calm sincerity. "Did you twist your ankle?" She looked down automatically, as if checking for an injury she had forgotten to notice. "No, I do not think so." Then she smiled awkwardly. "Although I'm usually the last person to realize when I have walked into something." A faint sound escaped him. Not quite laughter, more like someone remembering how to smile after a very long time. His closest associate noticed immediately. In 12 years working beside Adrian Romano, he had witnessed billion-dollar negotiations, impossible business deals, and impossible patience. He had never witnessed amusement over a milkshake. Emily finally looked up properly. She expected irritation, disappointment, at the very least, annoyance. Instead, she found a man whose sharp features somehow looked softer than they should beneath the streaks of pink running down his coat. He was strikingly handsome in a way that felt intimidating rather than glamorous, broad-shouldered, with dark hair neatly combed back and intricate tattoos disappearing beneath the collar of his crisp white shirt. There was something undeniably powerful about him, yet his attention remained entirely fixed on the embarrassed waitress standing inches away. Emily suddenly remembered what she still held in her left hand. A paper coupon. During the confusion, she had accidentally picked it up instead of another napkin. Without thinking, She offered it to him with complete sincerity. "This gives you 20% off any dessert today," she said hopefully. "I know it probably does not make up for ruining your coat, but our cheesecake really helps with bad afternoons." Complete silence followed. One bodyguard stared at the coupon as though it were written in another language. Another quietly looked toward the ceiling, hiding the corner of his mouth as it threatened to lift. Adrian lowered his eyes to the small piece of paper, then back to Emily's hopeful expression. For reasons he could not explain, the absurd little coupon felt infinitely more valuable than every expensive agreement waiting inside the leather briefcase one of his men still carried behind him. Emily stood frozen, still holding the empty tray against her chest like a shield, waiting for the stranger to reject the coupon with polite disbelief or silent annoyance. Instead, his eyes lingered on the tiny piece of paper before he accepted it with surprising care, sliding it into the inside pocket of his stained coat as though it were something worth protecting. "Thank you," he said simply. The words were quiet, almost effortless, yet they carried enough weight to make the entire room exhale. Emily blinked in confusion. "You are welcome," she answered uncertainly, wondering if this was one of those moments she would replay in her head at 3 o'clock in the morning while questioning every life decision she had ever made. Behind the stranger, one of the suited men leaned slightly toward another and whispered something too low for anyone else to hear. The second man answered with the smallest shake of his head, equally bewildered. They had seen their employer negotiate impossible deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars without changing expression. They had watched governors, executives, and celebrities wait nervously outside his office. Yet somehow a waitress covered in strawberry milkshake had accomplished what none of them had witnessed in years. She had made Adrian Romano smile. Emily hurried toward the service station, returning moments later with a clean white towel and a fresh glass of sparkling water. "This one is free," she said earnestly. "Not because you spilled anything. I mean because I spilled everything." She immediately covered her face with one hand. That sounded even worse out loud. A soft chuckle escaped from a nearby elderly couple. Even a little boy sitting 3 booths away giggled before returning to his grilled cheese sandwich. Emily laughed at herself too, shaking her head with gentle embarrassment. "I should probably stop talking while I still have a job." Adrian accepted the glass without taking his eyes off her. There was no calculation in her kindness. No hidden motive. She was not trying to impress him because she had absolutely no idea who he was. That realization settled somewhere unexpectedly deep inside him. Every conversation in his world carried invisible negotiations. Every smile expected something in return. Every compliment arrived with conditions attached. This woman had offered him a discount coupon and free water because she genuinely felt guilty about an accident. Nothing more. Nothing less. Across the room, Tyler pushed himself out of the booth with exaggerated confidence and walked toward the entrance. As he passed Emily, he slowed just enough to let another remark fall where only she could hear it. "Some people never change." His voice carried the familiar mixture of pity and superiority she had spent years trying to forget. Emily lowered her eyes instinctively, but only for a second. Then she quietly straightened her shoulders and answered with unexpected calm. "I hope that is not always a bad thing." Tyler looked briefly surprised that she had responded at all before shrugging and continuing toward the exit with his friends. Adrian watched every second of the exchange without interrupting. He noticed the tiny hesitation before Emily spoke. He noticed the way she forced herself to breathe evenly afterward. Most people would have remembered the insult. Somehow she seemed more concerned that her customer still had milkshake dripping from his sleeve. "I really am sorry about your jacket," she said once Tyler disappeared outside. "If it makes you feel any better, I accidentally washed my phone with my apron last month, so today is technically not the worst thing that has happened around me." Adrian raised one eyebrow. "Did the phone survive?" Emily smiled sheepishly. The rice survived. For the first time in years, laughter escaped him freely. It was low and brief, but unmistakably genuine. Every employee nearby turned instinctively toward the sound. The hostess looked at the cashier with wide eyes. The line cook peeked through the kitchen window. Nobody understood why the intimidating stranger with tattooed hands and the presence of a man accustomed to absolute authority was laughing because of a ruined cell phone. Adrian did not understand it either. He only knew that somewhere between the spilled milkshakes, the awkward apology, the ridiculous dessert coupon, and the young woman who kept finding reasons to smile after being treated unkindly, the carefully constructed walls around his heart had developed the smallest, most unexpected crack. After paying for a simple black coffee that had long gone cold, Adrian remained seated by the window long after every sensible customer would have left. His associates understood better than to interrupt. They simply exchanged puzzled glances while pretending not to notice that their schedule had already fallen 35 minutes behind. Across the diner, Emily returned to work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She carried fresh plates to waiting families, refilled coffee cups before anyone had to ask, wiped tables with practiced efficiency, and quietly hummed an old country song completely off-key whenever she believed nobody was listening. Every few minutes something small went wrong. She dropped a spoon into a bowl of soup, apologized to the soup before replacing it, bumped her elbow against a chair she had somehow forgotten was there, and even thanked an automatic paper towel dispenser after it finally released a towel on the third try. None of it looked rehearsed. She simply moved through life with the innocent optimism of someone who refused to let small embarrassments become permanent burdens. Adrian found himself watching with growing disbelief. In his world, mistakes invited criticism. Weakness attracted exploitation. Every decision demanded precision because people depended on him never to hesitate. Yet here was a woman who laughed softly whenever life refused to cooperate, as though imperfection deserved patience instead of punishment. It was a language he no longer remembered speaking. His closest advisor, Vincent, finally leaned forward. "Sir," he said carefully, "our meeting downtown begins in 20 minutes. Adrian did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on Emily as she accidentally knocked over a basket of wrapped jelly packets. They scattered across the floor like colorful marbles. Emily crouched down with an embarrassed smile, gathering them one by one. Before she could finish, 3 little children abandoned their booth and happily crawled across the floor to help her collect the packets. "Thank you, my tiny rescue team," Emily laughed. "You have officially saved breakfast." One little girl proudly handed her the last strawberry packet. "You are nice," the child declared. Emily gently tapped the girl's nose. "So are you. Never let anybody convince you otherwise." The little girl beamed before running back to her parents. Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment, unexpectedly troubled. Nobody had spoken to him with such uncomplicated warmth in years. Respect, certainly. Fear, constantly. Loyalty, often purchased. But uncomplicated kindness had become a stranger. Vincent quietly cleared his throat again. "Sir," Adrian finally stood, adjusting the front of his stained coat. "Cancel the meeting." Vincent blinked. "The investors flew in from Chicago. They can fly home. Without seeing you." Adrian calmly picked up the untouched dessert menu Emily had forgotten to remove earlier. His fingers paused over the handwritten note printed at the bottom. "Life is sweeter when shared." Such an ordinary sentence. Yet somehow it lingered in his thoughts. "Reschedule for tomorrow," he replied. "Today is no longer available." None of the men questioned him further. They had learned long ago that once Adrian Romano reached a decision, arguing only wasted time. As they approached the entrance, Emily hurried over carrying a neatly folded brown paper bag. "Excuse me," she called, slightly out of breath. Adrian turned back. She offered the bag with both hands. "The kitchen made an extra slice of New York cheesecake this morning. It was going to be thrown away because the topping cracked." She smiled apologetically. "I figured cracked cheesecake still deserves to be eaten." Adrian looked from the paper bag to her hopeful expression. "Are you giving this to me?" "Well, yes." Emily shrugged. "You had kind of a messy afternoon because of me, and nobody should leave hungry after surviving that much strawberry milkshake." One of Adrian's associates quietly stared at the floor, desperately hiding the smile, threatening to appear. Nobody had voluntarily handed their employer leftover cheesecake before. Adrian accepted the small package as though it weighed far more than a simple dessert. How much do I owe you? Emily looked genuinely confused. Nothing. Nothing. Kindness is not on the menu, she answered with a playful grin. So we do not charge for it. For several silent seconds, Adrian simply looked at her. The city outside continued rushing through another ordinary afternoon, but something inside him had become remarkably still. As he walked toward the waiting black SUV, the paper bag remained carefully balanced in his hands. Vincent opened the rear passenger door, then glanced curiously at the unexpected gift. "Sir," he asked after a long pause, "are you actually planning to eat leftover cheesecake from a neighborhood diner?" Adrian looked once through the restaurant window where Emily was laughing after nearly walking into a coat rack before catching herself at the last second. A quiet smile touched his face again. "No," he answered softly. "I am planning to remember the woman who believed it was worth saving." The black SUV disappeared into Manhattan traffic, yet Adrian did not open the folder waiting beside him, did not answer the steady vibration of his phone, and did not acknowledge the skyline sliding past the tinted windows. Instead, he unfolded the top of the small paper bag, resting carefully on his lap. The slice of cheesecake leaned slightly to one side, where the topping had cracked exactly as Emily described. It was imperfect, uneven, entirely ordinary. Adrian studied it longer than he had studied million-dollar contracts that week. Vincent finally looked over from the opposite seat. "Sir, should I ask the kitchen at the penthouse to prepare lunch instead?" Adrian picked up the small plastic fork tucked inside the bag. "No." He tasted one quiet bite. The cheesecake was rich without being overly sweet, creamy with a hint of lemon that lingered just long enough to make him notice. It was homemade, honest, comforting in a way he could not remember experiencing since childhood. "Well?" Vincent asked cautiously. Adrian stared out the window before answering. "It is good." Vincent almost smiled. "I meant the dessert." Adrian looked back at the paper bag. "So did I." Silence settled once more. After several minutes, another associate sitting in the front passenger seat glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, should we have someone investigate the waitress?" The question would have sounded routine to anyone familiar with Adrian's world. Every unexpected encounter was verified, every unfamiliar face documented, every coincidence examined. Adrian rested the fork inside the empty container. "No." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "No background check. No financial records. No certificates." Adrian shook his head once. "She spilled milkshakes, apologized 23 times, gave me a discount coupon, and sent me home with broken cheesecake. Not everyone is hiding an agenda." The men exchanged silent looks. Their employer trusted almost nobody. Yet today, he had accepted food from a complete stranger without hesitation. It made no sense. Across the city, Emily finished her afternoon shift by stacking coffee mugs and wiping the last empty booth. Her manager, Linda, approached carrying the day's schedule. "You handled yourself well earlier," she said warmly. Emily laughed softly while tying another trash bag. "I think the floor handled me better than I handled the tray." Linda smiled. "That gentleman left an excellent tip." Emily looked surprised. "Really?" Linda nodded and handed her the receipt. The tip covered almost an entire week's groceries. Emily's eyes widened. "There has to be a mistake. His signature is right there." Emily studied the elegant handwriting for a long moment. "Adrian Romano." She whispered the name quietly, testing its rhythm without recognizing it. "That is a beautiful name." Linda shrugged. "Maybe he just appreciated your kindness." Emily looked down at the receipt again before carefully folding it into her apron pocket instead of her wallet. Somehow it felt different from money. It felt like proof that one embarrassing afternoon had not ended as badly as she imagined. Later that evening, after changing into comfortable jeans and an oversized blue sweater, Emily stopped at the neighborhood grocery store. She compared prices carefully, placed fresh vegetables into her basket, then quietly returned a carton of expensive ice cream to the freezer after checking her budget twice. "Next paycheck," she whispered encouragingly to herself. As she reached for a bag of apples on the top shelf, two rolled onto the floor. One bounced beneath another shopper's cart. Emily sighed dramatically. "Please come back. I already adopted you. The older woman nearby laughed and helped retrieve the runaway fruit. You always talk to groceries? She asked. Emily grinned. Only the rebellious ones. They both laughed before continuing their shopping. Several aisles away, a man wearing a baseball cap lowered the phone in his hand after pretending to compare cereal brands. He quietly walked outside and made a brief call. She just left the store, he reported calmly. Nothing unusual. She thanked the cashier for organizing the shopping bags by weight. A short pause followed before he listened again. Understood. He ended the call without Emily ever noticing she had been observed. Back inside the SUV parked across the street, Adrian listened without changing expression. He had not ordered an investigation into her past. He had asked only one question before leaving his office that afternoon. Is she getting home safely? Now, watching Emily struggle to carry too many grocery bags while stubbornly refusing help from a shopping cart because she insisted she could manage, Adrian felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. It was not obligation. It was not curiosity alone. It was the quiet realization that somewhere in a city filled with people chasing power, success, and appearances, there existed one woman whose greatest concern after the hardest day of her week had been making sure a stranger did not leave hungry. The following Tuesday arrived wrapped in cold spring rain that painted Manhattan sidewalks with silver reflections and hurried footsteps. Emily stood outside the employee entrance balancing a paper cup of oatmeal in one hand, an umbrella that refused to stay open in the other, and her tote bag hanging stubbornly from one shoulder. Predictably, all three chose the exact same moment to rebel. The umbrella folded inside out after a gust of wind. The oatmeal tipped dangerously close to her sweater, and the tote bag slipped completely off her shoulder, spilling notebooks, pens, coupons, and a tiny plush keychain shaped like a smiling blueberry across the sidewalk. Really? Emily sighed toward the gray sky. We talked about teamwork this morning. A passing businessman smiled despite himself as he continued walking. Emily crouched to collect her belongings, carefully apologizing to a notebook that had landed in a shallow puddle. I know. It is not your fault. Just as she reached for the blueberry keychain, another hand picked it up first. She looked up immediately. There he was again. Adrian Romano stood beneath a large black umbrella, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy overcoat that somehow made the rainy morning appear almost elegant. Tiny drops of water rested on his dark hair, while the city rushed around him without disturbing the remarkable stillness he carried wherever he went. Emily's eyes widened with genuine surprise. You came back for the cheesecake refund? She asked before realizing how ridiculous that sounded. Adrian looked at the tiny, smiling blueberry in his hand before offering it back to her. I believe this belongs to you. Emily accepted it with a grateful smile. His name is Barry. Adrian glanced at the blueberry again. You named her keychain? Of course. She clicked it back on her tote bag. Everything deserves a name if it stays with you long enough. Adrian found himself studying the little plush fruit with complete seriousness. Barry, he repeated quietly. Emily nodded proudly. He has survived 2 washing machines, 1 airport, and an unfortunate encounter with barbecue sauce. Adrian almost smiled again. Remarkable resilience. He is stronger than he looks. She laughed. Unlike my umbrella, as if offended by the conversation, the broken umbrella flipped inside out once more. Emily stared at it for several seconds before whispering, You are being very dramatic today. Adrian reached toward the twisted frame. May I? She handed it over without hesitation. He examined the bent support carefully before giving it a gentle adjustment. The damage was too severe to repair properly, but he managed to straighten it enough for the fabric to open again. Emily tested it with visible excitement. It works. She looked at him with sincere admiration. You fix umbrellas too? Adrian answered with quiet honesty. Not usually. Well, you should add it to your resume. She paused. Actually, I never asked what you do for work. Vincent, standing several feet away beneath another umbrella, nearly stopped breathing. Adrian remained perfectly composed. Business. Emily nodded thoughtfully. That explains everything. Adrian raised one eyebrow. Does it? You have one of those faces. What kind of face? The kind that remembers birthdays, tax deadlines, and where people park their cars. Adrian blinked once. During 36 years of life, he had been described as intimidating, calculating, powerful, dangerous, brilliant, and impossible to read. Never organized. A quiet laugh escaped before he could stop it. Emily looked delighted. See? I knew I was close. Adrian glanced briefly toward Vincent, who now seemed deeply interested in a nearby traffic light. You are not close, Adrian admitted. Not even a little. Emily gasped dramatically. I have been confidently wrong. That somehow feels worse. Rain continued falling softly around them while the city hurried past without noticing the unusual pair standing on the sidewalk, sharing an entirely unnecessary conversation about umbrellas and blueberry keychains. For reasons Adrian could not fully understand, he did not feel any urgency to leave. Every responsibility waiting across town suddenly seemed less important than another minute listening to the woman who could transform ordinary moments into something unexpectedly warm. Emily looked toward the diner entrance as the morning shift approached. I should go before Linda starts timing my arrivals again. She smiled apologetically. Thank you for rescuing Barry and almost rescuing my umbrella. Adrian inclined his head slightly. You are welcome. Emily took 2 quick steps toward the door before turning back. By the way, she called through the gentle rain, if business ever gets boring, I still think you would make an excellent umbrella mechanic. She disappeared inside before Adrian could answer. He remained standing beneath the rain for several silent seconds, looking down at the umbrella still resting in his hand. Vincent finally walked beside him with careful curiosity. Sir, he asked softly, did she just suggest that one of the most influential businessmen in New York changed careers? Adrian looked toward the diner window, where Emily was already laughing with another employee. The corners of his mouth lifted once again. Yes, he replied, and somehow it sounded like the most reasonable advice I have received all week. Adrian told himself the meeting had gone well. Contracts had been signed, investors had left satisfied, and every decision had strengthened the empire he had spent more than a decade building. Yet when the conference room finally emptied, he realized he could not remember a single detail of the conversations that had occupied the last 4 hours. Instead, his thoughts kept drifting back to a smiling blueberry keychain named Barry and a waitress who believed broken umbrellas deserved second chances. He leaned back in his chair, overlooking the Manhattan skyline, while sunlight reflected across the glass towers outside. Vincent quietly organized documents into neat folders before glancing toward his employer. Sir, you have been staring at the same page for 12 minutes. Adrian lowered his eyes to the report in front of him. It was upside down. Without saying a word, he turned it around. Vincent politely looked away to hide the faint smile threatening to appear. That evening, Adrian left the office earlier than usual, something his staff noticed immediately because it almost never happened. The driver instinctively turned toward the penthouse, but Adrian calmly spoke before they reached the intersection. Take a different route. Which one, sir? Adrian looked out the window with practiced composure. The one that passes Sweet Haven. Nobody inside the vehicle commented, although every person understood perfectly well that there were at least 6 faster ways home. 20 minutes later, the familiar diner came into view. Adrian had no intention of going inside. At least that was what he repeated silently to himself. He only wanted to confirm that Emily had made it through another day without dropping milkshakes, apologizing to furniture, or adopting another piece of inanimate property. Fate, however, had developed an unusual sense of humor. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the front door opened, and Emily hurried outside, carrying 2 large trash bags. She did not see him. She was too busy trying to keep a cardboard box balanced on top of one bag, while pushing the door closed with her shoulder. Almost there, she encouraged herself. We are functioning like responsible adults. The bottom of one trash bag suddenly split open. Empty plastic containers, paper napkins, and dozens of tightly rolled drinking straws scattered across the sidewalk before a playful gust of wind sent the straws rolling in every direction. Emily closed her eyes for one long second. I stand corrected, she sighed. Chaos has won again. Adrian watched as she immediately began chasing runaway straws that seemed determined to explore New York without supervision. One disappeared beneath a parked bicycle. Another rolled toward a storm drain. Emily hurried after them, laughing at the ridiculous situation instead of complaining. Adrian quietly walked over, bent down, and picked up several straws before they escaped any farther. Emily looked up in surprise and immediately smiled. You again. It appears your relationship with gravity remains complicated. She laughed, so hard she nearly dropped the cardboard box too. Gravity and I are in counseling. Adrian handed her the rescued straws. Any progress? Minimal. She carefully tucked them back in a box. But we are committed to healthy communication. Adrian shook his head almost imperceptibly, amused by how naturally she transformed inconvenience into comedy. Together, they gathered the remaining supplies until the sidewalk looked normal again. Emily brushed invisible dust from her sweater before noticing something. Wait here. She disappeared inside for less than a minute and returned holding a small white bakery box tied with blue ribbon. Today nothing cracked, she announced proudly. Fresh blueberry muffins. Adrian accepted the box with quiet curiosity. Another gift? Emily nodded. I figured Barry would approve. Adrian looked at the ribbon, then at her cheerful expression. Does Barry make many business decisions? Only the important ones. She folded her arms with complete seriousness. He has excellent judgment. Adrian surprised himself by answering just as seriously. Then I should probably thank him. Emily grinned. He appreciates good manners. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of passing traffic faded beneath the simple comfort of shared silence. Adrian realized he had attended elegant galas, private dinners, and exclusive celebrations where conversations felt emptier than this quiet sidewalk. Emily glanced toward the evening sky, where the first stars struggled against the city lights. You know, she said thoughtfully, I still do not know your favorite dessert. Adrian considered the question far longer than necessary. Finally, he answered with complete honesty. Until last week, I do not think I had one. Emily smiled softly, unaware that the answer carried far more meaning than either of them could yet understand. The next afternoon, Emily arrived at Sweet Haven, carrying something wrapped carefully inside a small bakery box decorated with hand-drawn blue hearts. She placed it on the highest shelf in the kitchen where nobody would accidentally discover her surprise too early. Linda noticed immediately. Special order, she asked while organizing fresh pastries inside the display case. Emily smiled shyly. Not exactly. Birthday? No. Anniversary? Emily laughed. Definitely not. Linda folded her arms with playful curiosity. Then who is lucky enough to receive homemade dessert on a Thursday? Emily looked toward the front windows before answering. There is someone who always seems busy. She hesitated. He smiles so rarely that I thought maybe he forgot what good blueberry cake tastes like. Linda raised an eyebrow, but chose not to ask further. Sometimes kindness deserved privacy. While customers gradually filled the dining room, Emily disappeared into the kitchen during every quiet moment to check on the little round cake she had baked before sunrise. It was far from perfect. The frosting leaned slightly to one side, and one blueberry near the edge had rolled away before the icing finished setting. Emily stared at it with dramatic disappointment. You had one responsibility, she whispered to the runaway blueberry. Stay symmetrical. She considered fixing it before shaking her head. No, nobody is perfect. She gently placed the blueberry back on top. You still belong. Across town, Adrian attempted to concentrate on another afternoon of meetings. Unfortunately, every discussion seemed to end with someone mentioning desserts without meaning to. One executive requested coffee after lunch. Another suggested celebrating a successful agreement over dinner. Someone even placed blueberry jam beside a tray of fresh croissants. Adrian noticed all of it. His own thoughts became increasingly unreasonable. By 3 o'clock, he realized he had read the same paragraph 5 times without absorbing a single word. Vincent quietly closed the presentation folder. Sir, Adrian looked up. Yes. With respect, you have approved the same budget twice and rejected it once. Adrian glanced at the documents. Vincent was correct. I see. Vincent spoke carefully. Would you prefer to continue tomorrow? Adrian remained silent for several moments before standing. Cancel the remaining appointments. Again. Adrian picked up his overcoat. Again. 40 minutes later, the familiar bell above the diner door rang softly as Adrian stepped inside. Emily looked up from arranging fresh muffins in the display case. Her face brightened with unmistakable delight before she could hide it. Business must be very stressful, she said cheerfully as he approached. Adrian tilted his head. Why? Because you keep escaping to diners. He considered answering with something serious before surprising himself. Perhaps I have found better meetings. Emily laughed, then suddenly remembered the bakery box waiting on the top shelf. Do not move. She hurried toward the kitchen so quickly that she almost collided with the swinging door before catching it at the last second. Adrian watched her disappear, while wondering why the room suddenly felt lighter than when he entered. A minute later, Emily returned carrying the carefully wrapped cake with both hands. This is for you, she said with quiet excitement. Adrian accepted the box gently. Another gift? Well, Emily looked slightly embarrassed. Technically, it is a thank you gift. For what? For fixing my umbrella. Adrian blinked. I did not actually fix it. You made it hopeful again. She smiled with complete sincerity. Sometimes that counts. Adrian slowly untied the ribbon and opened the lid. Inside rested the little blueberry cake, charmingly imperfect, with slightly uneven frosting and a tiny handwritten note resting beside it. The note read, Every good day deserves dessert. Barry agrees. Adrian looked from the cake to Emily. You baked this yourself? She nodded proudly. At 5 o'clock this morning. Then she frowned at the frosting. Please ignore the leaning side. It developed confidence issues halfway through decorating. Adrian looked at the imperfect cake for several long seconds before lifting his eyes toward the woman standing nervously in front of him. In a life surrounded by flawless presentations, polished speeches, and carefully rehearsed conversations, nobody had ever awakened before sunrise simply to make him something imperfect with honest affection. And for the first time in many years, Adrian Romano felt the quiet, unmistakable weight of a truth he was no longer able to deny. The happiest moments of his week no longer happened inside boardrooms or behind closed office doors. They happened whenever an endlessly optimistic waitress looked at him as though the world was still capable of surprising them both. That evening, Adrian carried the little blueberry cake back to his penthouse with the same care another man might reserve for a priceless family heirloom. The staff noticed immediately. His house manager had watched priceless artwork arrive from Europe without receiving more than a brief glance from him. Yet today he personally carried a simple white bakery box into the kitchen instead of handing it to anyone else. Would you like me to refrigerate it, sir? The house manager asked politely. Adrian looked down at the slightly uneven frosting before shaking his head. No. Would you like dessert prepared with dinner? No. Coffee. Adrian smiled faintly. Just a plate. A few minutes later, he sat alone beside the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan, the city glowing beneath the evening sky, while silence filled the luxurious dining room. He carefully sliced a small piece of the cake. The frosting leaned exactly as Emily had apologized for. The blueberries were not arranged with professional precision. One layer was slightly thicker than the other. It was imperfect in every measurable way. Somehow it was also the best dessert he had tasted in years. Not because of the ingredients, because every bite carried unmistakable sincerity. Across the table, Vincent quietly reviewed tomorrow's schedule before noticing Adrian staring at the handwritten note once again. Every good day deserves dessert. Barry agrees. Vincent read the words aloud before looking up. Sir. Adrian folded the tiny note carefully and slipped it inside his wallet instead of throwing it away. Yes. Vincent hesitated longer than usual. May I ask something personal? Adrian nodded once. You may. Vincent rested the folder on the table. When was the last time someone gave you something without expecting anything in return? The question lingered between them. Adrian searched his memory with surprising difficulty. Business gifts always carried strategic value. Charity galas expected donations. Holiday presents strengthened alliances. Even compliments usually arrived before requests. Finally, he answered quietly, "I do not remember." Vincent nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. Perhaps that is why this feels different. Adrian looked back toward the city lights shimmering beyond the glass. That is exactly why it feels different. Much later, after everyone else had gone home, Adrian walked into his private office where framed photographs from years past lined one wall. There were pictures with world leaders, celebrated athletes, respected entrepreneurs, and influential public figures. Every smile in every frame looked carefully practiced. His gaze drifted toward the empty bookshelf opposite them. Without fully understanding why, he placed the tiny blueberry note inside a leather-bound journal resting there. He stood quietly for several moments before speaking softly to himself. "This has to stop." The words echoed gently through the empty office. He knew the truth with painful clarity. Emily belonged to an ordinary world filled with early morning bakery shifts, grocery budgets, neighborhood diners, and conversations about rebellious umbrellas. His own life operated under entirely different rules, surrounded by responsibility, complicated decisions, constant attention, and people whose motives rarely remained simple. The farther she stayed from his world, the safer her gentle heart would remain. He owed her that distance, even if she never understood why. The next morning, Adrian canceled his usual route downtown and deliberately instructed the driver to avoid the neighborhood where Sweet Haven stood. Every turn away from the diner felt strangely heavier than it should have. He immersed himself in meetings, reviewed reports personally, accepted every appointment that crossed his desk, and refused every quiet moment that allowed his thoughts to wander. Yet shortly after lunch, he found himself absent-mindedly reaching into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed against something soft. Barry's tiny blueberry sticker, which Emily had secretly attached to the bakery box, had peeled loose and somehow remained inside his pocket. Adrian looked at the smiling cartoon face for several silent seconds before shaking his head almost helplessly. At that exact moment, several miles away, Emily placed 2 fresh blueberry muffins inside the display case before glancing instinctively toward the front entrance. She smiled politely at every customer who walked inside, but each time her expression softened again when it was someone else. Linda noticed without saying anything. Finally, near the end of the afternoon, she gently asked, "Are you waiting for somebody?" Emily looked embarrassed by the question. "Maybe. The businessman?" Emily laughed quietly and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. "He said business keeps him busy." She shrugged with innocent optimism. "That probably means he is having a really good week." Then she smiled anyway, completely unaware that across the city the same man was quietly fighting the strongest internal battle he had faced in years, not against competitors or impossible negotiations, but against his own growing certainty that staying away from the woman who had unknowingly brightened his life was becoming far more difficult than meeting her ever had been. 3 days passed without Adrian walking through the front door of Sweet Haven, and although Emily never admitted it aloud, she noticed every single one of them. She still smiled at every family who ordered pancakes, still remembered which regular preferred extra pickles on his turkey sandwich, and still laughed whenever Barry bounced against her tote bag while she hurried between tables. But every time the small bell above the entrance chimed, her eyes lifted automatically before she could stop herself. Each time she quietly reminded herself not to be disappointed. Busy people stayed busy. That was all. On Friday afternoon, the diner filled earlier than usual. Office workers escaped before the weekend. Students celebrated the end of exams, and the kitchen moved with cheerful urgency. Emily balanced 2 burgers, a basket of fries, and 3 glasses of iced tea with growing confidence. "Look at me," she whispered proudly. 0 disasters for almost 4 hours. Fate apparently considered that a challenge. The front door opened, and Tyler Benson walked inside once again with 2 co-workers wearing expensive watches and confident smiles. Emily's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly before she reminded herself to breathe. Linda noticed immediately and stepped closer. "Would you like me to take that table?" she asked quietly. Emily hesitated for only a second before shaking her head. "No." Her voice remained gentle but steady. "I cannot spend the rest of my life hiding from one customer." Linda squeezed her shoulder with silent encouragement. Emily picked up 3 menus and walked toward table 7 with professional composure. "Good afternoon. Welcome back." Tyler leaned comfortably against the booth and looked her over with the same familiar expression that had once convinced her she would never be enough. "You still work here?" he asked. Emily smiled politely. "That is usually how jobs work." One of his co-workers laughed softly, surprised by her answer. Tyler ignored it. "I figured maybe you would have finally started that fitness program you kept talking about." Emily placed the menus neatly on the table. "Can I get everyone something to drink?" Tyler folded his arms, still changing the subject. Emily met his eyes for the first time in months. There was no anger in her expression, only quiet dignity. "No, I'm just doing my job." Tyler leaned back with a careless shrug. "You always settled for too little, Emily. You could have changed if you really wanted to." For a brief moment, the old hurt returned. She remembered every diet she had started because someone else thought she should. Every birthday cake she pretended not to want. Every photograph she volunteered to take so she would not appear in it. The memories arrived like familiar shadows. Then something unexpected happened. She thought about homemade blueberry cake, about broken umbrellas, about a man who had accepted cracked cheesecake as though it were priceless because someone had offered it with kindness. Emily slowly smiled. It was small, but completely genuine. "I have changed," she answered softly. Tyler frowned. "Really?" Emily nodded. "I finally stopped believing that my worth could be measured by someone else's opinion." The words surprised even her. They arrived quietly, without rehearsal, carrying a confidence she had not realized she possessed. Tyler laughed dismissively, but the laughter sounded thinner than before. "Keep telling yourself that." Emily gently wrote down the drink order without another argument. 1 iced tea, 1 black coffee, and 1 lemonade. "I will be right back." She turned calmly toward the kitchen. Her hands trembled only after she passed through the swinging doors. She rested them against the stainless steel counter while taking one slow breath after another. Linda looked up from organizing dessert plates. "Are you all right?" Emily nodded, although tears shimmered briefly in her eyes. "Almost." She smiled through the emotion. "I just needed to remember something." "What?" Emily looked toward the dining room, where sunlight poured through the front windows. "That being kind to myself is not the same as giving up." She washed her face with cool water, straightened her apron, and returned to the floor with her usual warm smile. She never noticed the familiar black SUV stopping quietly across the street at that exact moment. Inside, Adrian had finally surrendered to the argument he had been losing for 3 days. He had told himself he was only stopping for coffee before another meeting. Then, through the large front windows, he saw Emily carrying a tray toward table 7, while Tyler's unmistakable expression of quiet contempt lingered across the booth. Adrian's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not with anger, but with profound disappointment. He had spent years learning how to recognize people who confused cruelty with confidence, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. Without saying a single word, Adrian opened the car door and stepped onto the sidewalk, completely unaware that the next few minutes would quietly change all 3 of their lives. The little bell above the entrance chimed softly as Adrian stepped inside, carrying nothing more than his usual calm expression. Yet something about his presence made the busy room seem quieter without anyone understanding why. Emily had just placed the drinks on Tyler's table when she noticed him standing near the front window. Relief flashed across her face before she could hide it, warm and genuine, like sunlight finally breaking through several cloudy days. "You came back," she said instinctively. Adrian met her eyes and answered with the faint smile she had somehow become accustomed to drawing from him. Business became less convincing. Emily laughed softly. "I was beginning to think every umbrella in New York had already been repaired." Adrian glanced briefly toward the nearby booth, where Tyler watched the exchange with visible curiosity. Apparently not. Emily lowered her voice as she adjusted the tray in her hands. Can you wait just a few minutes? I'm almost finished here. Adrian nodded without hesitation. Take your time. She smiled gratefully before turning back toward table 7 with a fresh pot of coffee. Tyler watched Adrian for another moment before looking back at Emily. Interesting, he muttered. Your new customer seems to like spending time here. Emily carefully refilled the coffee cups. He likes blueberry muffins. Tyler smirked. Sure, that must be it. Emily chose not to answer. She had learned that silence often protected peace better than clever words. As she finished pouring the last cup, Tyler leaned forward and spoke just quietly enough that only she could hear. Do yourself a favor, Emily. His voice carried the same familiar confidence that had once controlled her every insecurity. Do not imagine. Someone like him is actually interested. Men like that eventually notice appearances too. For the briefest instant, her fingers tightened around the coffee pot. The old ache returned, quieter than before but still recognizable. She looked across the room, where Adrian patiently waited without checking his watch, scrolling through his phone, or showing the slightest irritation. He simply sat there as though waiting for her conversation to finish mattered more than whatever else his afternoon contained. Emily slowly set the coffee pot onto the serving station beside the booth. Then, almost without thinking, she walked toward Adrian instead. Tyler watched with folded arms. Emily stopped beside Adrian's table, leaning down just enough that only he could hear her gentle voice. Can I ask you something a little strange? Adrian looked up immediately. Anything. She hesitated, twisting the corner of her apron between nervous fingers. Please do not misunderstand. Adrian waited patiently. Emily smiled with quiet embarrassment. Would you stay here for another 5 minutes? Adrian's expression softened. Of course. She looked down briefly before whispering the words she had never intended anyone else to hear. I just need someone kind nearby right now. The sentence was almost carried away by the noise of the diner, but Adrian heard every single word. Emily quickly added, Not because I expect you to solve anything. She searched for the right explanation before giving up on perfect wording. Sometimes people make you feel like you're taking up too much space. Then someone walks into the room and reminds you that maybe you are allowed to exist exactly as you are. Adrian remained completely still. For years, people had asked him for influence, introductions, investments, protection, advice, and opportunities. Nobody had ever asked him for something as heartbreakingly simple as 5 quiet minutes of kindness. Emily gave an awkward little smile. I know it sounds silly. Adrian slowly shook his head. No. His voice was steady, almost impossibly gentle. It sounds honest. She nodded gratefully before starting to step away. Adrian spoke again, stopping her. With only a few quiet words. Emily. She turned back. Their eyes met across the small table. You have never taken up too much space. He smiled faintly. You have simply spent too much time around people whose hearts were too small to make room for you. Emily stared at him in complete silence. Her eyes filled before she could stop them, not with sadness this time, but with the overwhelming relief of finally hearing someone say the word she had needed for years. She laughed softly through the emotion, brushing one tear away before it could fall. You really are terrible for waterproof mascara sales, she joked. Adrian smiled again, unaware that across the room, Tyler had heard enough of the conversation to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the woman he once convinced she was never enough had quietly become someone who no longer needed his approval at all. Emily stood quietly for another moment, still holding the empty coffee pot, trying to steady the emotions Adrian's words had awakened inside her. For years, she had believed confidence belonged only to people who looked different, dressed differently, or fit neatly into someone else's definition of beautiful. Yet one gentle sentence had somehow reached places that years of self-doubt never allowed anyone else to touch. She smiled one last grateful smile before returning to work. Tyler watched her approach with an expression that shifted uneasily between irritation and disbelief. Something had changed, and he could no longer control the conversation the way he once had. "So," he said with forced confidence, "your mysterious businessman gives motivational speeches now." Emily calmly placed the check presenter on the table. "No," she smiled softly. "He just listens better than most people." Tyler scoffed. "You really think somebody like him is going to stay interested?" Emily looked at him for several quiet seconds before answering. "I do not know what tomorrow looks like." Her voice remained warm, free of anger. "But I finally know I do not have to earn basic kindness." The simplicity of her answer left Tyler without an immediate response. One of his co-workers shifted uncomfortably in the booth before, clearing his throat. "Honestly, Emily," he admitted, "you have been nothing but professional since we walked in." The second co-worker nodded in agreement. "She has treated us better than we probably deserved." Tyler looked toward them in surprise. Neither man laughed this time. The easy confidence he had carried into the diner began slipping away, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that nobody around him seemed impressed anymore. Across the room, Adrian observed everything in silence. He made no dramatic entrance, no public confrontation, and no attempt to embarrass anyone. Instead, he quietly reached for his phone and typed a brief message before placing it back inside his pocket. Less than 2 minutes later, Vincent entered the diner carrying a slim leather folder. He approached Adrian respectfully and spoke in a low voice. "Everything has been handled." Adrian gave the smallest nod. "Thank you." Vincent then walked directly toward Tyler's table with calm professionalism. "Mr. Benson?" Tyler looked up, confused. "Yes." Vincent handed him a business card. "Your office has been attempting to reach you." Tyler frowned. "How do you know where I work?" Vincent smiled politely. "Your company's executive director requested that you contact her before the end of the business day regarding an internal review that has already been scheduled." Tyler's expression changed instantly. "What review?" "I believe she will explain it personally." Vincent's tone never lost its courtesy. Several clients recently submitted concerns regarding repeated complaints about unprofessional conduct toward colleagues and customers. The company has decided those concerns deserve immediate attention. Tyler stared at the card in stunned silence. One of his co-workers slowly looked away, suddenly remembering conversations they had privately shared with management over the previous months. None of this had been created by Adrian. It had already existed. Adrian had simply ensured the forgotten concerns finally reached the people responsible for addressing them. Vincent offered one final courteous nod. "Have a pleasant afternoon." He returned to Adrian's table without another word. Emily had witnessed only part of the exchange from behind the dessert counter. She walked over carrying Adrian's coffee refill with curious eyes. "Is everything all right?" Adrian accepted the fresh cup. Sometimes people simply meet the consequences that have been waiting for them. Emily looked toward Tyler, who now sat unusually quiet while reading messages on his phone. She gently lowered her voice. "You did not do anything bad, did you?" Adrian looked directly at her before answering. "No." Emily searched his face carefully. "Promise." "I promise." She released a relieved breath and smiled. "Good." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "You were worried?" Emily nodded without hesitation. "I did not want anyone getting hurt because of me." Adrian's expression softened in a way that even Vincent had rarely witnessed. There was again that impossible kindness. Even after years of being criticized, embarrassed, and underestimated, her first instinct was still to protect other people from unnecessary pain. Adrian realized then that the strongest person in the room had never been the one with influence, wealth, or authority. It was the woman standing beside him. Carrying nothing more powerful than compassion, she refused to surrender, no matter how many times life had tried to convince her she should. Closing time settled gently over Sweet Haven as the last customers drifted into the cool Manhattan evening, leaving behind the comforting scent of fresh coffee and warm bread. Emily wiped the final table with slow, thoughtful movements, replaying the extraordinary afternoon in her mind. Tyler had left without another cruel remark. For the first time since they had met years ago, she had not felt defeated after seeing him. She simply felt free. Linda switched off the glowing dessert display and smiled across the quiet diner. "You seem lighter tonight." Emily looked down at herself with exaggerated confusion. "Really? I definitely ate one blueberry muffin during my break." Linda laughed. "That is not what I meant." Emily smiled softly. "I know." Outside, Adrian waited beside the sidewalk instead of getting into the waiting SUV. The city lights reflected across rain-soaked pavement while evening traffic flowed steadily around them. When Emily finally stepped outside carrying her familiar tote bag, Barry the blueberry swinging happily from the zipper, she looked genuinely surprised to see him still there. "You're still here?" she asked. Adrian nodded. "I was hoping we could walk a little." Emily smiled. "I would like that." They wandered slowly through the neighborhood, without rushing toward any destination. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply listened to the city around them. After several quiet blocks, they reached a small park where benches overlooked a peaceful fountain. Emily sat first, stretching her tired feet with a relieved sigh. "My sneakers and I survived another day." Adrian sat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. "Congratulations to both of you." Emily laughed. The sound echoed softly beneath the trees. After a comfortable silence, she glanced toward him. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." She studied him with sincere curiosity. "Who are you really?" Adrian looked toward the fountain before answering. "A man who spent too many years believing success meant becoming impossible to reach." Emily waited quietly. "And now?" He turned to meet her eyes. "Now I think I was wrong." Emily smiled, though she still sensed there was more he was not ready to share. She accepted that without pressing further. Some stories arrived only when they trusted the listener. She reached in her tote bag and pulled out a small folded paper. "I made something for you." Adrian unfolded it carefully. It was not another coupon. It was a simple hand-drawn certificate decorated with smiling blueberries. Across the top, Emily had written in colorful marker, "Official Lifetime Umbrella Mechanic." Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, it read, "Payment includes unlimited muffins and one grateful friend." Adrian stared at the paper for several seconds before quietly laughing, a full, genuine laugh that carried farther than either of them expected. Nearby joggers glanced over with curious smiles. Emily looked wonderfully pleased with herself. "I knew you needed a promotion." Adrian carefully folded the little certificate and placed it inside his wallet beside the handwritten dessert note she had given him days before. "This may be the most valuable document I own." Emily looked at him with playful suspicion. "You are exaggerating." "Only slightly." They both laughed again. At that exact moment, Vincent approached from a respectful distance, having waited patiently beside the SUV. "Sir," he said softly, "we should probably leave." Emily blinked. "Sir." Vincent immediately realized what he had revealed, but remained politely silent. Emily looked back at Adrian with growing curiosity. "People keep calling you sir." Adrian took a slow breath. The time for half-truths had quietly reached its end. "Emily, there is something I should have told you sooner." He explained calmly that he owned several companies, employed thousands of people, and lived a life much larger than the simple businessman she believed she had met. He left out everything that belonged in another world and spoke only about the truth that mattered. Emily listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for several long seconds. Adrian prepared himself for distance, disappointment, perhaps even fear. Instead, Emily tilted her head thoughtfully and asked the one question he never could have predicted. "So," she pointed toward the bakery box, still resting inside the SUV from earlier that afternoon. "Does this mean really successful businessmen still have to pay for blueberry muffins?" Adrian stared at her before another helpless laugh escaped him. "Yes," he answered warmly, "especially if Barry approves the invoice." Emily nodded with complete seriousness. "Good, because Barry is very strict about accounting." They both laughed until tears formed in the corners of their eyes. The city continued rushing around them, unaware that two people from completely different worlds had just discovered the rarest kind of wealth either of them had ever known. It was not measured by appearance, influence, or money. It was measured by the quiet courage to see another person's heart before judging anything else. Months later, A framed certificate labeled Official Lifetime Umbrella Mechanic still rested inside Adrian's office where expensive awards once stood alone, and every Friday afternoon a reserved table at Sweet Haven remained occupied by two friends who never seemed to run out of conversations about blueberry desserts, broken umbrellas, or a tiny, smiling keychain named Barry. Emily never became smaller to deserve love. She simply found someone whose heart was finally big enough to recognize the extraordinary beauty she had carried all along. And on that ordinary New York sidewalk, the world quietly remembered what dignity, kindness, and unconditional respect truly looked like.